Hi. So I was just resting and I came across a report, which isn't really surprising, but I think it just reiterates the situation that we're in. And it's about media restrictions in China. Well, worse than that, media, or rather threats to the media in China in the current environment. Now, first things first, before I read out this report, it's never been particularly easy for foreign journalists to report within China, but it's not a case that it's totally forbidden. In the past, journalists have had access and they've been able to report on big events like the Beijing Olympics and the National People's Congress and things like that relatively freely, but nevertheless with a sort of atmosphere of restraint. But that's definitely escalated. It's got worse in recent years, particularly with the reporting on the persecution of the Uyghurs, which really, like I keep saying, fits all the hallmarks of a genocide. There's definitely genocidal aspects to it in terms of the forced sterilization and so on. Anyway, this is a report. BBC China correspondent John Sudworth moves to Taiwan after threats. The BBC's Beijing correspondent John Sudworth has left China and moved to Taiwan following pressure and threats from the Chinese authorities. It doesn't say who this report itself is by. Sudworth, who has won awards for his reporting on the treatment of the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region, left Beijing with his family. The BBC says it is proud of his reporting and he remains its China correspondent. China has denounced the BBC's coverage of Xinjiang. Sudworth, who was based in China for 9 years, said he moved to Taiwan after it became increasingly difficult to remain in China. And this was with his family as well. So it's not just uprooting his life, it's also his family. He and his family were followed to the airport and into the check-in area by plainclothes police officers. His wife, Yvonne Murray, reports in China for the Irish public broadcaster RTE, so she's also a journalist. Sudworth said he and his team faced surveillance, threats of legal action, obstruction, and intimidation wherever they tried to film. His reporting colleagues are still in Beijing, and he says he intends to continue his reporting from Taiwan. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said the authorities had not been given prior notice. Only in recent days, when we were faced with the task of renewing Sudworth's press card, did we learn that Sudworth left without saying goodbye. After he left the country, he didn't by any means inform the relevant departments nor provide any reason why, Hua Chunying told a news conference in Beijing. Well, she is the public face of Communist Party lies. She's sort of the Joseph Goebbels of Xi Jinping's regime, as far as I'm concerned. In its statement, the BBC said John's reporting has exposed truths in the Chinese authorities did not, John's reporting has exposed truths the Chinese authorities did not want the world to know. The number of international media organizations reporting from China is shrinking. Last year, China expelled correspondents for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. And in September 2020, the last two reporters working in China for Australian media flew home after a 5-day diplomatic standoff. Foreign Correspondents Club of China says foreign journalists are being caught up in diplomatic rows out of their control. Abuse of Sudworth and his colleagues at the BBC forms part of a larger pattern of harassment and intimidation that obstructs the work of foreign correspondents in China and exposes their Chinese news assistants to growing pressure, the FCC said in a statement posted on Twitter. That's, of course, another thing to remember. Domestic Chinese citizens who are assisting foreign journalists themselves can be subject to harassment. Right, there's a few ways to look at this because inevitably you will get Chinese nationalists saying, oh, well, the West is lying and Western media bias, Western media lies. But they fail to understand the contradiction in their position because, on one hand, they're accusing Western media outlets like the BBC of lying about the situation to make China look bad, and yet there is serious restrictions on what journalists can do. So you can't say journalists are lying if you're also saying, "Oh well, we don't want you to know the truth," or "We're going to restrict your reporting." So if you want them to tell the truth, then allow them access, full access. Uh, what's China hiding? You know, if it's innocent, then what's it got to hide? As simple as that. Um, this may be part of a tit for tat because, of course, in Britain we suspended the license of CGTM, and I personally was involved in that. I pushed that. I created a petition for it. But the difference is obvious. The BBC does not air forced confessions. Now, the BBC has many faults. In Britain, it's controversial with the license fee and so on. But I would really urge British viewers here, if you dislike the BBC, don't conflate two different issues. Don't conflate some of the domestic grievances with the BBC and its biased reporting on the domestic front to the situation in foreign affairs, because I really do think that there is a different dynamic to news reporting in that sort of frontline journalism versus kind of domestic political journalism. I do think there's a difference. Um, I don't always defend the BBC. I don't like everything about the BBC. I do think it can be arrogant at the top. But when it comes to frontline journalism, especially from a country like China, where it is very difficult to report, I've got nothing but respect for journalists in that situation. You know, they get the harassment from the authorities. They also probably get a lot of trolling harassment from Chinese nationalists. Calling them Western spies and all that sort of thing. Um, and it does take quite tough skin to do that sort of job. It's hard work, but it also takes tough skin, and I would say a degree of courage. Um, so, I think this just speaks volumes. And the hypocrisy of the Chinese regime is astounding. On one hand, they demand that they have a voice in the West. Their diplomats are very outspoken and they're always reprimanding the West when they're in the West. And yet, when it's the other way around, they really, really want to restrict access. And in the bottom of this evaluation, which side is more transparent? Which side is more tolerant? I think when you weigh everything up, you'll find the West is a lot more tolerant. The West will put up with a lot of abuse that China doesn't, frankly. I would argue maybe too much. I think when the Chinese regime makes these rants, I think things are changing. I think we're starting to toughen our resolve. Um, these MPs and other people who've been sanctioned by Beijing for no other reason than revenge. That's all. That is literally the only reason that they're being sanctioned. Um, they wear it as a badge of honor. Five MPs and I think four others, lawyers and activists. Um, China's got no evidence against them, to claim that they're lying. All this is Beijing lashing out because it's being exposed for what it's doing. Um, because they want a situation where they can have a voice in the West, and they'll use our principles of free speech against us. Oh, free speech. That means we should be able to undermine your societies and smear human rights activists and threaten people and stoke up the diaspora to bully other students, for example, in the situation of university campuses. But the hypocrisy is infuriating because if you're in China, and I know this from first-hand experience, you have to be extremely careful what you say. Now, I would contend that Chinese nationals in the West, maybe in the current environment, they can't exactly be very vocal, but the risks that they would face are far, far, far less. Ultimately, we can't arrest, say, a Chinese student just for saying they support the CCP. I think it's arrogant and it's disrespectful to the host nation, but ultimately they're not breaking any laws. So I do think, though, we should say that, you know, Chinese nationals in our society, they are ultimately guests and they should expect to behave as guests, if they want to be treated in that way. But this is a tit for tat situation, and it really is looking like the development of a new Cold War. Um, the fact he's now in Taiwan, it's good in a sense because he will be safer there. On the other hand, that obviously restricts his work, and I imagine on a personal basis, it's stressful, having to relocate your family. As for the Chinese authorities saying we were not given a reason why he left, they know full well why he left. They're just playing games with rhetoric. They know what they're doing, and it's just another reminder of how this regime behaves. They've been doing it for years. They've always complained about Western media bias, but even when the West, or even when Western outlets try to show China in a good light, they won't recognize that. I mean, I saw an interview with Nusrat Ghali, one of the MPs, Nusrat Ghani, excuse me, who was sanctioned. And the BBC actually played the devil's advocate for China. They actually said, well, the Chinese say that you're, lying about this. So the BBC, in its quest for neutrality, will actually play the devil's advocate for China on occasion. That's the irony about this. So for these Chinese who think it's this anti-China organization, in Britain, the BBC is seen as very left wing. Many would say it's far too soft on China, in fact. But as for frontline journalists, I've a lot of respect for them because it takes guts, it takes hard work, and there's just no comparison. A few years ago, and this was one of the reasons I really became quite resentful about CGTN and its behaviour. They had a journalist, Kong Lin Lim, and she attended an event in Birmingham, which was a human rights conference organized by, I think it was a Tory group on China, a committee, I forget the precise title. Also, Benedict Rogers, who I've previously mentioned, he was the founder of Hong Kong Watch. Anyway, this so called journalist, instead of just asking a question like a normal journalist would, she got up and made this nationalistic rant and called Benedict and others basically anti-China stooges, or she got into this very childish rant. And she also, then when she was told to calm down and stop, basically threatening people, she assaulted a young volunteer and she was arrested. Um, Now, instead of apologizing for her behavior, the Chinese embassy and her employer, CGTN, demanded an apology from the British side. So imagine if a BBC journalist went over to China and basically started yelling about how, like literally yelled at a communist official about how dishonest and cruel the CCP was. You forget being kicked out of the country, they would be arrested as a communist spy. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous, this situation. So I think we need to just reiterate their hypocrisy. We should not accept their bullying behaviour. And if it is a situation where there's more media restrictions in China, it just shows that they're hiding something. It's difficult because it means that Uyghurs and other people who are being persecuted, they've got less of a light on their situation. But this is how the CCP operates, and I just think I'm so pleased that we did strip CGTN of its license. It took too long. I would like to see the same thing happen to RT, but it's better than nothing. At least now they don't have, media outlook in this country. Internet's different. They can still put out their propaganda online, but at least they cannot put out the propaganda on television. Why does that matter? It matters because CGTN has engaged in forced confessions. Now, a network that airs forced confessions, it's not a credible journalistic source. That is betraying the principles of transparent journalism. So this isn't a case of penalizing them just because they're Chinese. It's because they have engaged in the forced confession of a British citizen, among other reasons. Um, so this development it's just a reminder of how the thugs in Beijing operate. And unfortunately, they do have their support. There'll be a lot of Chinese nationals who will welcome this and say, "Oh, good, the BBC liar is gone." But there's something in that really intense nationalistic mindset that there's just no critical thinking. It's just that we're right and the West is wrong, and that's it. Um, and the way I look at it is, you need to compare the two societies. Which is more transparent? Which is more tolerant? I think the answer is obvious.